This week's Technique Tuesday video delves further into reading knitting charts by looking at some of the most common chart symbols. As always, if you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, there are direct links down in the description. I have kind of a silly chart here. This isn't a real knitting chart, but it does include some of the most basic symbols that you will encounter in a chart, aside from the symbol for knit, or purl, or color, and those we covered last week. So I have a little swatch. I'm working in stockinette, and this chart represents a mostly stockinette piece of fabric that has a few symbols in it that represent particular stitch techniques that we might encounter in a chart. So the first thing to understand is that the symbols used in a knitting chart are not random. Nobody went through the old Zap Dingbats fonts of the 1980s and 90s and just randomly chose some symbol to represent a knitting technique. These symbols have meaning. Every row of a chart tells you exactly how to work that row of knitting, but it also tells you what the result of that row is going to look like. So this isn't just telling you, if we can refer to the key, this isn't just telling you that to work a yarn over here. It's showing you what that yarn over is going to look like in your fabric. So every one of these symbols was chosen for a specific reason. So I want to go through each one of these and then show you the results so that you can understand why a symbol might be chosen for a particular pattern. And I really recommend, if you are starting with a chart that has some unfamiliar symbols and they don't really make sense to you, I would recommend casting on a few stitches for a swatch and just working through those chart symbols in your swatch and seeing what the result looks like after you have worked that technique. And then things will start to click with you and you'll be able to not only read the chart, but you'll be able to read your knitting. I'm about to start row 5 here, and if we refer to the chart, we can see that this is a yarn over, and this diagonal line refers to a decrease called SSK. The blank boxes, of course, are knit stitches. This diagonal line refers to a knit 2 together, and then we have another yarn over. So I'm going to work across these 10 stitches, and then we're going to look at the results, and we'll see why these symbols were chosen. So the first task is to knit 2 stitches. Then we do a yarn over, and then we work this first decrease, which is an SSK. So as I'm working the SSK, I slip 2 stitches as if to knit. I insert my left needle. Look at my working needle. It's pointed to the left, just like that decrease is. Now I'm going to knit a stitch. Now I'm going to work a knit 2 together. And once again, look at what direction my working needle is pointed. It's pointed to the right as I enter those 2 stitches. I work another yarn over, and then I finish with 3 knit stitches. Now let's compare what we've just worked to what was on the chart for that row. So when we are checking our knitting against the chart, we do not look at what's on the needle, because these are potential stitches. These are not stitches of any particular type. We look under the needle. So we need 2 knit stitches. We can see we've got 2 knit stitches. Then we have a yarn over, and look, we've got this hole that resembles very much that circle on the chart. And then we have this SSK decrease, and if you look at it, originally I had 2 columns of stitches. I worked the decrease. Remember, my working needle was pointed to the left, and look at the result. The stitch on the right is the one that's on top, and it's leaning to the left. Then we've got our single knit stitch. Then we've got our knit 2 together, and again we started with 2 columns of knits, and now we've got the one on the left is on top and it's leaning to the right, and our working needle was pointed to the right as we were working it. And then we've got the yarn over. We can see that eyelet under the needle, and then we have our 3 knit stitches. So that is one of the main advantages of a chart, and one of the points of using charts is that the results you get will look very much like the chart itself, or the chart will look very much like the results that you get. So I'm not going to work just one purl row. I'm going to work 3 rows of stockinette, and then we'll work this row here. The V refers to slipping a stitch, which is just inserting your needle and moving it over to the other needle without actually working it. This symbol here represents a knit through the back loop, and this one, which is the upside down version of that, represents a make one increase. So let's look at what these actually look like, and then we'll talk about the results. So we're going to slip a stitch, and the V really refers to, if you look at stockinette stitches, they look like V's themselves, and a slipped stitch is just an elongated version. It's going to be the same stitch, is just going to span 2 rows, and so that V just sort of visually represents what an elongated stockinette stitch would look like. So then we're going to knit 3 stitches, and then we're going to knit a stitch through the back loop like this. And if you look at the result of a stitch that was worked through the back loop, you can see that at the base of the stitch, the legs are crossed, unlike a regular knit stitch, which is open at the bottom. So that visually very much represents what a knit through the back loop looks like. Then we're going to knit 2 more stitches, and then we're going to do a make one increase. So make one increases can be done a number of different ways. One method is to lift the running thread between the 2 stitches on each needle. And after that's lifted, then you work it so that it twists. So in many ways, it looks identical to a stitch that was knit through the back loop, because it in fact was knit through the back once that lifted strand was raised. So why would that symbol be chosen? And how can you differentiate it from that one? If you look at this one, how are you supposed to know, is that supposed to be knit through the back loop or make one? Well, the difference is that in order to work that stitch so that it twists, you had to go below that strand. You had to lift it up from below. You weren't working a stitch that was actually on the needle. You lifted something from below. So that kind of indicates, if you were to extend these lines here that kind of represent that running thread, that you were lifting that up in order to work it so that it twists. So that's a reason that you can understand why that symbol was chosen. So the next thing I want to talk about is something that are called no stitch boxes. So if you look on this chart, you'll see that I have a column of gray stitches here, or boxes here, and some up here at the top. And if you look at the chart, it says no stitch. So the point of a chart, as I mentioned, is for it to visually represent the finished item. And in this particular case, the finished item is this fingerless mitt pattern. So this pattern starts with ribbing at the bottom, and it's kind of an unusual ribbing. There's some knit 2s and purl 2s, but there's also some knit 1, purl 1, knit 1 columns as well. And this pattern flows into the pattern on the mitt. This mitt starts with 27 stitches across, and then it gets increased to 29 stitches. And that's what this chart shows, is that the full width of the back of the hand of this fingerless mitt is 29 stitches wide, but we started with 27. So the no stitch box is simply a placeholder. It means that when you are reading across this row of stitches, you read what's in each box, and you take that action accordingly. Knit 1, purl 2, knit 1, purl 1. When you get to this box, you ignore the box. You don't ignore the stitches on your needle. You ignore the box in the chart, and then you just go to the next action. So this is telling you that there's no action to be taken here. Go to the next step. So eventually there will be an increase, and then the number of stitches will fill this entire chart. And again, this is so that the chart will visually represent the finished item. So here we have these columns of purl stitches right here that flow into the columns of purl stitches that flank those cables. And the increase is done in here. So we want that that continuity to be maintained in the chart as well as in the thing that you're actually knitting. So here's a chart that has a lot of familiar symbols in it that we've seen already. It's got one unfamiliar symbol, and if we check here, we can see that that's knit 3 together, and we can take just a second to figure out, well, why would this particular symbol be chosen to represent knit 3 together? Well, what you can see at the base is that there are 3 lines, each representing the 3 original stitches, and then they merge and they become a single line, and that line is angled to the right. Just like the result of a knit 2 together leans to the right, the result of a knit 3 together also leans to the right. This is a chart that is written for flat knitting. You can see because there are row numbers on both sides of the chart. And this black box surrounds the area that is the repeat. So these 12 stitches are repeated over and over again for however many stitches you have on your needles. And once you're done with the repeats, you'll have one final stitch that you knit. If this were knit in the round, you wouldn't have this column. This column is to create symmetry to the beginning of the row so that you have a column of knits beginning and ending the pattern. One of the nice things about a repeat like this is that you can place markers on your needle every 12 stitches to show you when a repeat is ending, and that can help you keep on track. So if you get to a marker and you either have extra stitches or not enough stitches, then you know something went wrong between these 2 markers. So you either worked a decrease incorrectly or didn't work it at all, or on a previous row you may have neglected to do a yarn over, which could cause you to be short stitches at that point. But you know that the mistake is between those 2 markers. So this is another lace chart that has a few differences that I want to point out. First of all, we see another new symbol, and this one has an abbreviation SK2P that stands for slip 1 stitch as if to knit, knit 2 together, and then pass the slip stitch over. So it is a double decrease, just like the knit 3 together, but it's a decrease that's going to lean to the left. That is not the only decrease that exists that leans to the left, and it is possible that you will see this symbol being used for a different double decrease that leans to the left. So even if a symbol is familiar to you, it's always good to check the key to see if this is what you think it is. So you can look at this and say, oh, it's a left-leaning double decrease, probably. Wonder which one it is, and you can look it up. So that's new. The other thing is that you'll see that like the previous chart, there is a repeat box. This one is 14 stitches across, but in this case, before you start working your repeat, you have a single column of stitches that you need to work, and then you can go into your repeat and work these 14 stitches as many times as is required for your pattern. And then once you're done with your repeats, you have 2 stitches at the end. The problem with this one, with using markers with this one, is that when you get to row 6, you have a decrease right before the repeat starts, and you have a yarn over afterwards. So lace always has a compensating decrease for every yarn over, and we have that here, but the decrease is before the repeats, and the yarn over increase is afterwards, and this is going to cause some problems with your markers. So here I've got a swatch of this stitch pattern on my needles, and I have a 3-stitch garter stitch border before and after. So rather than just 1 stitch before this marker, I've actually got 4, because every row these 3 stitches are going to be worked as a border. It's very common with chart knitting that they won't include the border within the chart. So I have the first marker showing where this position is here, the second marker showing the end of that first repeat, and then the third marker showing the end of the second repeat, and then I have the final 2 stitches, and then I have my border stitches. The problem when I come to row 6 is that after I work my border stitches, which I will do now, is that I need to work a knit 2 together, and I only have 1 stitch, and that's because it takes 2 stitches use 2 stitches when you create a decrease. So when you have a situation like this, where you have a decrease at the beginning of the row and the compensating yarn over isn't until after the end of the last repeat, you have to move your markers for every repeat to the left by 1 stitch. So once I've done that, then I have my 2 stitches available to do my decrease. I still have 14 stitches in between the 2 markers to work this repeat and 14 stitches between these 2 markers to work that decrease. I only have 1 stitch after the marker, but I'm going to be creating it by working a yarn over. So again, if you start with a decrease and end with a yarn over, you need to move your markers to the left one. But if you start with a yarn over outside of the repeat box and you end with a decrease outside of the repeat box, then you would move everything to the right by 1 stitch. Now this chart has one other thing that is different about it, and that is you'll see that there are only even numbers listed on the chart and that there are yarn overs and decreases on every row of this chart. This is very common with lace charts, to exclude the wrong side rows, or if you're working in the round, to exclude the alternate rows that are only worked in stockinette. There's no action other than that. And so this can create a smaller chart that perhaps is a little bit easier to follow and certainly takes up less space in the pattern itself. Before you cast on for a project, knit a swatch using the chart in order to become familiar with the rhythm of the stitch pattern. Being able to work through all of the rows of a repeat several times with just a few multiples will give you a solid foundation before you cast on hundreds of stitches with perhaps dozens of multiples. The swatch will teach you where you are most likely to make mistakes so that you can be on the lookout when you get to that point in the chart. And the familiarity gained by swatching will reduce the number of errors you're likely to make in the real project while you're establishing the stitch pattern. The symbols used in a good chart will be meaningful and will in some way represent the result you will get. Figuring out why a particular symbol was chosen is the real key to knitting from a chart. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.